Using chromatic passing notes is really just a part of what we consider the sound of jazz when it comes to solos. We've all heard it in the solos by Charlie Parker, George Benson, Wes Montgomery, and pretty much everybody else. But you can also use this when it comes to playing chords when you're comping, and you can get some really great sounds out of it. In this video, I'm going to go over a few different approaches for this. So just using this in the top note melody of chords, but also inner voices and adding complete chromatic chords to your comping, and in that way create some interesting and surprising sounds. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. When you're adding these chromatic ideas to both the melody and also the inner voices, then sometimes if you look at a chord in the middle of a phrase, then you're going to have a chord that seems completely out of place and completely unrelated to what is happening around it. And I think that's a beautiful example of how melodic movements in the voices are really much more important than whatever sort of vertical chord that we might be looking at. So in that sense, melody is stronger than harmony. Let's look at how to add some chromaticism to some top note melodies. You can get away with most things if you're adding chromatic notes to the melody and the chords that you're working with, just as long as you kind of manage to resolve it back into the chord along the way. And that's also what's happening here. In fact, what I have here is that I'm moving on the D minor 7 between the D and the E, and then just adding the E flat as a chromatic passing note. If we look at beat 2, then the chord that's there is in fact an F7 chord, which doesn't have anything to do with a 2-5-1 in C major or a D minor chord. But since the melody just keeps on moving, then it's all okay, and we can just continue to the next chord, which does a similar thing, just move down a half step on the G7 altered, adding a leading note between the flat 13 and the flat 5, and then finally resolving to the 9 of the C major 7. In this example, I'm using a similar idea, except I'm moving on the D minor 7 from G down to F, so we get... And then on the G7, nothing is really happening, it's just G7 moving down to the flat 13. Then on the C major 7, I have kind of two chromatic things happening actually. I have two voices moving, the melody and then the middle voice. So the melody is moving from D down to C, and the middle voice is moving from A the other way, so A up to the major 7B, and then we have... And using this counter movement is really efficient to create a more interesting sound and have a lot more stuff happening in the chords. It's also quite common on major 7 chords that you move chromatically between the 9 and the root, and you can go both ways, and the same goes between moving from the 6 up to the 7 or down again, as you will see in other examples. This example has a static melody on the D minor 7, but then I have an inner voice that's moving. And in the beginning, actually what I'm playing is like an F major shell voicing. So I don't really have a complete D minor 7, but I have the 5th that I'm moving up to A sharp, so A sharp, B up to C, and here I have my complete D minor 7. Then I go to G7, and finally, through adding a G, resolve to a C major 7 sharp 11. Before we move to adding complete chromatic chords, then it's also useful to just have a look at what happens when we use some really closed voicings, like this one, and then add some chromatic movement. And here, on the D minor, I have chromatic movement in the middle of the voicing. And it's just a nice, really simple melody. It's actually the melody from the first example on the D minor, so E down to D, and then back up to E. And then moving over to the G7, and then resolving to this open sounding C major 7. But we can also choose to not just have a chromatic note in a voice, but also harmonize that as a complete chromatic passing chord. And that's what I'm doing in this example. So I'm moving from this D minor 11 up to this D minor 9. And I'm doing that by adding a C sharp minor 9 chord in between. So, and then I'm actually extending the D minor 7 into the G7 bar, and then moving to G7 altered, resolving to C major 7, and then adding a chromatic fill in the inner voice here, where it's just D moving down to C. But of course we can also use chromatic passing chords on the dominant, like I'm doing in this example. First we have on the D minor, just basically an arpeggio movement from C up to E and then up to an A. And then that's harmonized. And the way I'm doing that is just using different D minor voicings. It doesn't really matter too much because what's important is that I have this melody. And then the final part of it where I have also again counter movement in the two top voices, because I have first this D minor 7 and then moving to this D minor 11 where we have this movement in the top voices just to create a little bit of interest in that way. And then on the G7 first, G7 9, and then I want to move, so A flat G, and the way I'm doing that is I'm taking the A here, then using this A flat because I want to end on this G with the 13. And that means that the top voice is doing this, but the second highest voice is doing this. So there's another melody happening in parallel under it. And then from here, just altering that dominant, resolving, and again using the idea of moving from the 7th down to the 6th in the middle of the C major 7. So what you probably want to take away from this video is just look at the examples and the small melodies that I'm using and try and move them to the chords that you're usually playing and see what you can come up with. In that way you can really put it to use in your own playing and create a lot of interesting voicings and a lot of interesting variations that you can just embellish your comping with. If you want to check out some more voicings that you can start working with for this, then check out this video where I'm going over 9 different types of voicings that are all really useful when it comes to playing jazz.